Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome you to Desert Water Agency's webinar on drought projections and planning. We thank you for attending, and we're really glad that we can connect with you during this time. My name is Vicki Pettick. I am the Outreach and Conservation Associate for Desert Water Agency. Happy to be here with you today and all of our speakers that we have to present to you today. So just a few things to go over before we get started with our presentations. Just to let you know, you are in listen-only mode. You are muted. Nobody can see your camera. They can't see you. So if you do have any questions that may pop up for you during the webinar, you can go ahead and put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. And the chat or Q&A should be located at the bottom panel of your Zoom screen. And you can use either one of those to ask questions, or even if you're having possibly even some technical support, you can put that in the chat, and we'll do our best to try and help you out with that. This webinar is actually being recorded, and it will be available later on our website at dwa.org/virtual. And I will add that into the chat after we get going here. It's also going on Facebook Live. So if for some reason somebody wasn't able to possibly register, you know somebody who wasn't able to attend, they might be able to catch it on Facebook Live, but it is being broadcast there now. So what we like to do to kind of kick things off is we like to start out with a poll. And it's kind of our welcome poll, just to kind of give us an idea of who our attendees are, you know, what their interest is throughout the webinar, what may interest them. So there's a few questions there. I'm going to give you maybe about a minute if you would answer those, and then we will go over the results here in just about a minute or so. And also, too, just a reminder that the Facebook audience, unfortunately, you won't see the polls. That is just for the people who would be attending live on the session on your phone or your laptop or desktop. So we'll go over the questions though, and go over the results as well here in just to give you a few more seconds. Okay, so our results here. Have you attended a DWA workshop in the past? Looks like we have a lot of first timers, which that's great. This also applies to our webinars that we have been offering now for about a year, since we aren't able to gather actually physically at one of our workshops here at our agency. We do have a lot of first timers, which is great. Hopefully, you know, this will give you a lot of information that you've been curious about knowing. We do have kind of a mix of, yes, we do have some people that have attended online and have actually done both, which is great. So the next question is, what best describes you? So our attendees, what best describes the attendees today? So it looks like we have quite a few residents that, you know, from whether they're from our service boundary or outside of our service boundary, that's great. And it does also look like we have some water agency employees and possibly some board members of some other water agencies, which is wonderful too. Hopefully, maybe later on during the Q&A or chat, they might be able to share some of their expertise to some people asking questions. Our last question was, do drought conditions concern you? And I think, of course, that's going to be overwhelmingly yes, very much. Probably a lot of our attendees are very concerned with the current conditions that have been brought to our attention. So I appreciate you answering those questions. That gives us a little bit to go on as we continue with our presenter. So I'd like to go into our first presenter, introduce our first presenter. Our first speaker is Janine Jones. Janine is the Interstate Resources Manager for California Department of Water Resources, or DWR. She has more than 30 years of experience with DWR. She's a registered professional engineer in California and Nevada. And she's going to speak today to the current drought conditions that we're experiencing in California. So take it away, Janine.
Okay, here we go. Okay, so as many of you are probably already aware, we have been taking action on the dry conditions now. And so far, we have a state emergency proclamation that was issued in April covering Sonoma and Mendocino counties, and a proclamation that was issued in just a week ago, actually, a little over a week ago, covering Central Valley counties, or the counties in the Central Valley watershed. Together, these emergency proclamations, plus one that had remained in effect for a limited number of counties from the last drought in the southern San Joaquin Valley, we cover about 41 counties now with these emergency proclamations. Some counties have also adopted proclamations at a local level. I think we're up to about 9 counties so far. The first counties to adopt were ones in the driest part of the state to date, which is the North Coast area, specifically Sonoma and Mendocino. And also all of the state actually is covered by a USDA county drought disaster designation, which is a tool that USDA uses to make financial assistance available for agriculture. The criteria that USDA uses for that is based on the US Drought Monitor, and the bar is set really quite low for eligibility, because USDA's assistance is to make financial assistance immediately available to agricultural producers, especially for the livestock producers who are so affected early during drought conditions. So if we think about what does our, if we think about what our precipitation supplies look like so far, this is where we are for the water year to date. This is percent of average precipitation, and essentially all of the state is in the below average range, and probably about half of the state is at a 50% of average level, roughly. So very dry conditions. And this follows on for most of the state as a second dry year. In the water year 2020, the prior water year, the northern 2/3 of the state was roughly below average. And because our statewide precipitation is so influenced by what goes on in the wettest part of the state in Northern California, last year actually ranked as 13th driest of record in terms of statewide precipitation, although there were a few areas in Southern California that were actually above average. So if we look at what does this mean for stream flow, we can really see the effect of these dry conditions. So this graphic is showing what we call natural flow, which is a calculated number that reflects runoff that has been adjusted to account for any out-of-basin diversions. And this is for our major Sierra Nevada watersheds that supply most of the state's developed water sources. And the purpose of this graphic is to point out that if we look at this water year to date, in comparison to our two driest years from the last drought in 2014 and 2015, we see that this year is actually tracking below those dry years in the northern part of the state, and in the same neighborhood largely in the southern part of the Sierra. So these are very dry conditions which have a significant effect on stream flow. Also, that means that we are not seeing precipitation reach reservoirs because the runoff is depleted by soil moisture and by warm temperatures. And right now, a couple of our largest important Northern California reservoirs, Lake Shasta for the Federal Central Valley Project and Lake Oroville for the State Water Project, are right around that half of average capacity range, which is not good for water supplies for the customers of those water projects. Another way to look at storage is to look on the groundwater side, and it's a little more difficult to compare here because groundwater doesn't respond as quickly to rainfall as reservoir storage does. So in this particular plot, I'm showing change in groundwater levels statewide since 2017. 2017 was the wet year that ended our prior 5-year drought of 2012 to 2016. And we can see that some areas of the state certainly have not recovered well in that time, particularly in the southern San Joaquin Valley, which is an area of long-term groundwater overdraft. And if we look at a little bigger picture, it's important to recognize that in this century, and I know it sounds a little odd to say that, but in this century, more than half of the years have either been a declared drought or a dry year. So we are seeing persistent long-term drying conditions. We had a statewide drought in 2007-2009, another in 2012 to 2016, and we are now back down in that dry range again. And if we look at the effect of this on annual runoff at a statewide scale, you can really see how the moving average, which is the orange line on this plot, is reflecting that diminution of water supply, in this century. And you can also see that we do have a lot of high variability in our water supplies. If you think back to our last drought, it was ended by a water year 2017 that was one of the wettest years on record for Northern California. In 2018, we went back to very dry conditions. And in 2019, we were wet, but not as wet, and downhill since then. So we are seeing this preponderance of dry conditions. And if you are wondering where we rank so far for full water years, this is looking based on runoff. Now, I had mentioned that last water year 2020, was the 13th driest in terms of rainfall, but it is drier in terms of runoff because of the effects of dry soils, warm temperatures, and just evapotranspiration by plants on runoff. So last year, USGS provisionally ranks as 5th driest of record, falling just behind our driest year of the last drought. And if we look at precipitation comparison, so we're now looking at statewide precipitation, these 2 years compared to our last drought, you can see that we're, very dry so far, particularly in this water year. And worth pointing out that this is occurring in a climate of warming. If we just look at the last 12 months, so a year looking backwards through last May, we see that at the moment, California is ranking as second warmest on record, as is much of the Southwest. So the Colorado River Basin, for example, is also experiencing the prolonged warmth and dry conditions that we are in California. And if you just look back at the state of California, looking at temperature rankings in this wet season, so starting in November, what we really see is the Sierra Nevada in particular is exceptionally warm, which obviously is not good for mountain snowpack. And one of the interesting things that happened this year is that I had just showed you the comparison of stream flow for 2014 and 2015. Well, in 2014 and 2015, we were record low in terms of snowpack. In 2014, we tried the previous record of 1977 for only 25% of average statewide snowpack. And in 2015, we set a new record of 5%. Of statewide snowpack, 5% of average. This year, we had statewide snowpack on April 1st, which is the metric we commonly use, at 59%. So as we, started into the warmer part of spring after the 1st of April, we were expecting to see some of that snowpack show up in our reservoirs in the form of runoff. But what happened was that we really didn't see it. And in particular, in the northern part of the state, particularly the Sacramento Valley, where much of our developed water supplies come from, there was, we were expecting about 500,000 acre-feet more of runoff than we got, reflecting the impacts of these prolonged warming conditions. And that was actually what triggered the drought emergency proclamation for the Central Valley counties. Now, if we want to do a little analytical exercise and see how our recent conditions compare with our historical record going back a little before 1900, one way to do that is to pick an area of the state, and I am picking the Sacramento Valley here because that's our workhorse for water supply from a statewide perspective. The yellow triangle is the period of record average, so since 1896, and we are just looking at the ratio of average temperature to precipitation. The orange dots are the 21st century, and the fact that they are concentrated on one end of this plot suggests that something is going on here. And I could show you this same plot for all of the other climate divisions in the state, and you see exactly the same pattern that we are seeing a regime shift, if you will, in terms of our hydrologic conditions. So, the interesting question, we've had 2 dry years now. What happens next year? Well, unfortunately, the historical skill of NOAA precipitation outlooks at the long lead times, for example, being able to ask at the beginning of fall, will this winter be wet or dry, is virtually nil for California. The areas that are white on this map have essentially no skill for these NOAA forecasts. So that's the status of the operational forecasts that are available. And an interesting point is that since our 2007-2009 drought, we've made good progress in fulfilling some of our major data gaps associated with drought conditions. Statewide coverage of groundwater level data, we did not have that in the 2007-09 drought. And we also saw a lot of problems with small water systems in rural areas, systems that may only have a few hundred connections. And that is starting to be addressed through legislative remedies such as financial assistance. But one area when there's been no progress is in this question of seasonal forecasting. How wet will next winter be? And particularly troublesome in the last drought were the forecasts during the Super El Nino, or the Godzilla El Nino, as it was called, where many folks in the science community were saying that, oh, well, you know, it's an El Nino, it's a very strong El Nino. We are going to need Noah's Ark for Southern California. That was actually being messaged in the news a lot at the time. And what happened was that dry conditions continued, especially in Southern California. So in other words, a complete flop in the NOAA forecast. So this also reflects the fact that the forecasting approaches that are used now by NOAA and by others in the research community rely very heavily on attempting to correlate ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, with precipitation. But in fact, the only relationship we see for California is that a La Nina year, such as the one that we experienced this winter, tends to be dry, really no predictability for the other year types or the other ENSO types. So not surprising that this hasn't proved to be a useful forecasting tool for California. So we at DWR, the Department of Water Resources, have been working with the research community to attempt some highly experimental research forecasts. This is one done by us by NOAA's Physical Science Labs in Boulder, and they pretty much correctly called the winter season for California and the Southwest as being dry, but this is something we need to get a lot better at if we're able to answer this successfully, this question about what's the winter going to be like. What we can say about what the winter will be like is that we're going into water year 2022 with extremely dry antecedent conditions. We're going to have very low runoff efficiency, as we did this spring. And bottom line, we're going to be able to achieve anything resembling average runoff, we would have to have a very wet year. So anyway, that is where I end and turn this back to our moderator.
Thank you, Janine. I appreciate that in-depth view of what our current conditions are. And yes, unfortunately, California does have very unpredictable water patterns, and we need to be prepared for that unpredictability. But we appreciate that very, very detailed view of what we're experiencing now and possibly what we'll experience in the coming years. So just to also mention is you can add your questions to the Q&A box and to the chat, and we will be going over some of those questions at the end after our presenters, after our speakers have finished up. We'll try and answer as many of those questions as we possibly can. So moving on to our next speaker, I'd like to introduce Zoe Rodriguez Del Rey. Zoe has been the Water Resources Manager for CVWD, or Coachella Valley Water District, for 3 years. She represents Coachella Valley Water District on several water resources planning efforts. She has been working in water for 15 years as a consultant to water utilities. And today we have Zoe speaking to groundwater conditions in Coachella Valley groundwater conditions in the Coachella Valley at this time. So Zoe, when you're ready, take it away.
Thank you, Vicki, and thank you to everyone on the line in DWA for this very timely webinar. So today I'm going to be sharing a little bit with you updates on the conditions of the Coachella Valley groundwater basin. This is an important piece of how this region deals with drought conditions. So I want to start with some basic concepts and a little bit of history of water management in the Coachella Valley. And I like to start with this particular figure because it condenses a lot of information. First of all, it shows the extent of the Coachella Valley, roughly from where I-10 and 111 intersect to the Salton Sea. It also shows the aquifer systems that this region relies on for its potable water, including drinking water. And just to go over what an aquifer system is, it's essentially underneath the ground. There are sediments, it could be sand, silts, rocks, that can hold water in the space between them, and that water can be extracted through wells. Historically, that water comes naturally from runoff from the surrounding mountains. Obviously, for folks that you are from this area, you know that in the valley floor, there's very little precipitation, about 4 inches on average per year. But in the surrounding mountains, that could be as high as 30 inches. So we have 2 aquifer systems that we rely on for potable water, and that includes in the blue, the smaller Mission Creek Subbasin, and then just south of that, extending from north down to the Salton Sea, is the Indio Subbasin. That's divided into the area in green for management purposes called the West Whitewater River Subbasin area. And in the east in red, the East Whitewater River Subbasin area. So in addition, we have, this figure shows these graphs that show water levels at selected wells. And these really tell very well the history of groundwater management in the Coachella Valley. We have, if we go back to about the 1960s, we have periods of groundwater level declines as population increased. And then with the onset of management of groundwater and water supplies in the Coachella Valley, we see that those groundwater levels have either increased or stabilized throughout both of the subbasins that I mentioned. And this has been achieved through a series of management actions, including conservation, but very important, bringing in imported water and replenishing that at 4 facilities, one in Mission Creek, one in Whitewater, called Whitewater Groundwater Replenishment Facility, one in the Mid-Valley called Palm Desert, and one in the East Valley called Thomas E. Levy. So what's a replenishment facility? Simply put, they are basins generally located in areas with alluvial sediments. Those are sediments that are fairly sandy, so they lend themselves to infiltrating water. So water is brought in, spread in those basins, and allowed to percolate or infiltrate into the groundwater basin, replenishing it. And some of these areas have infiltration rates of up to 5 feet per day. So it really lends itself to being able to bring in imported water and putting it back into the aquifer system. So I'm going to begin talking about the Indio Subbasin first, because it is the larger, more populous, has higher water use. And I do want to mention that there's 4 agencies that collaborate on groundwater management: Desert Water Agency, Coachella Valley Water District, but also Indio Water Authority and Coachella Water Authority. And their boundaries are shown on this map. And it really is beneficial when it comes to groundwater for agencies to collaborate. It is a shared resource. So because the Indio Subbasin has the higher amount of water use, I do want to kind of briefly touch on the demand and supply for that subbasin. In 2020, that subbasin across all sectors used just above 550,000 acre feet. And an acre foot of water is about the amount of water that covers an acre a foot deep. So putting that in context. About half of the demand was from agriculture, primarily in the East Coachella Valley, and the other half urban, which includes homes, businesses, golf courses. So how was that demand met? It was met partly through imported water brought in through the Coachella Canal in the East Coachella Valley. And the other half by groundwater. So groundwater is a very important component of our water supply. But that imported water, it's delivered directly to customers for irrigation, both for agriculture, but also golf courses, meaning that they don't have to pump groundwater. But it is also used to replenish the groundwater aquifer system in those basins that I showed a little bit earlier. The basin also uses recycled water, about 2%. Those are local renewable supplies, as well as some small amount of local surface water from mountain streams. So I want you to remember that number, 550,000 acre feet, because it becomes important later on in the presentation. So the groundwater basin, we talked about groundwater use, about half of annual supply being provided by groundwater. So being able to maintain that supply is important. And the way that we track that is through an annual groundwater balance. Think of it as your bank account. There's money coming in, money going out. It's the same thing with water. You have inflows to the basin and outflows. So in the Indio subbasin, the majority of the outflows are extraction or pumping of groundwater. And the inflows are a mixture of natural runoff. So the natural replenishment, which is about 58,000 acre feet a year. Now compare that to that number that I mentioned earlier of 550,000, so tenfold higher in terms of total demand. And it really puts into context the critical role that our imported water supply play. The other inflows to the basin are returns just from natural human uses of water. And a very big component is that artificial recharge of imported water. So in 2019, we had more inflows than outflows. So we gained about 137,000 acre feet in storage. I want to just quickly show another year. The scale is slightly different, but the outflows were about the same. In that particular year, we had less artificial recharge because there was less imported water available. As Janine mentioned, when you rely on imported water, say from those northern projects, they can have a lot of variability year to year. So in 2020, we lost 29,000 acre feet in storage. And the story of variability carries through. This is a little bit of a busy graph. What I want you to focus on are the gray bars. The yellow line, which shows, the gray bars are the annual change in storage. And then the yellow and green lines show the average change in storage over a 10 and 20-year period, respectively. So focusing on that, you see that in those 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, we were losing storage almost on an annual basis because there were more outflows than there were inflows. Management actions like acquiring additional imported water, conservation, has meant that since about 2010, you see those big years where we've actually put back more water into storage, more inflows than there have been outflows. As a result, we have seen positive trends since 2010, and the 10-year average has been positive since 2017, more water coming in than is leaving. So cumulative change in storage, when you add each of those years together, you see that prior to about 2010, we were losing storage, but since then, we have been returning storage, and it's that storage that is put into the basin that really helps us to get through these drought periods and modulate the effects of drought. And then the graph to the right shows replenishment at all of those replenishment basins that I mentioned previously. You can see on the year to year the variability, and then the orange line shows the cumulative. showing that since replenishment was started first at Whitewater in 1973, over about 4.5 million acre feet of water have been brought into the basin and replenished. So how do we monitor the health of the aquifer in the Indio subbasin? Well, we take readings at wells. Altogether, we measure on an annual basis about 385 wells distributed throughout the basin. And what I want to show you next is what those changes in groundwater levels look like over a 10-year period. The graphic that you're seeing here basically takes groundwater levels in 2020 and compares them to groundwater levels 10 years ago, and then uses a color ramp to illustrate the changes. So the green to blue means increases in groundwater levels. And as you can see, most of the basin is in that color ramp. So in the last 10 years, as would be expected, based on those increases in storage, we've seen increases in water levels throughout most of the area, ranging from about 2 to all the way up to 50 feet. So Mission Creek Subbasin, I'll cover that subbasin as well. And as you can see, and was illustrated in the larger Coachella Valley picture, this is a smaller subbasin, and that'll be reflected later on when I talk about the water use there, etc. But there are 3 agencies that collaborate on management: Coachella Valley Water District, Desert Water Agency, and Mission Springs Water District. So going again to that groundwater balance, amounts coming in, amounts leaving, the first thing you'll notice is if you look at the axis, the amount of water, we're talking about almost, a magnitude lower, less population, smaller, but similar concept. Pumping of water in the Mission Creek Subbasin is just above 14,000 acre feet. With about 6,000 acre feet of water that just leaves the basin through natural processes. There's about 9,000 acre feet of natural replenishment, and then that artificial recharge component with imported water. So in 2018, the amount coming in because of that artificial recharge was greater than the outflows, so we added about 1,200 acre feet to storage. However, when we look at a year like 2020, when less recharge water was available for Mission Creek, you see similar pumping, similar natural inflow water coming from the surrounding mountains. But in that particular year, because of that lower artificial recharge with imported water, the basin lost about 5,200 acre feet in storage. So this next graph, similar concept, the annual change in storage going back to 1978. The gray bar showing the change every year. And in this case, the purple and blue lines show that average over a 10 and 20 year period respectively. And a similar story where storage was being lost, and then water management, and in particular the construction of the Mission Creek replenishment facility where imported water is spread and infiltrated into the basin in 2002, has allowed Desert Water Agency to bring in a lot of water into that facility that they operate. So the result is that when you look at the average year over year, there's been positive trends since 2005, and both the 10-year and 20-year average of change in storage is positive. This is, a very good situation to be in terms of sustainability and in terms of having those reserves in groundwater storage to get you through these drought periods. So again, cumulative change in storage declines through the 2000s, with rebound in storage in the recent decades, with about 80,000 acre feet having been added to storage. And since replenishment began in that area, there's been about 160,000 acre feet of imported water brought in. 24 wells are monitored to keep track of what groundwater levels are doing, and those are distributed in the basin. And again, similar concept, change in storage over a 10-year period, slightly different color, but the message here, when you look at the legend and what these colors mean, is that there's been a significant increase in groundwater levels of up to 20 feet throughout most of the Mission Creek subbasin. So in summary, the management of the groundwater supplies and the groundwater basins in the Coachella Valley put us in a great condition as we go into these periodic droughts and can draw on those reserves. If you are interested in digging into any of this into greater detail, this area is complying with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and we submit annual reports. The ones for 2020 have been submitted and are available online at either agency's website. And we are also updating the plans that are the long-term plans to make sure that we continue to manage the groundwater sustainably, as well as plan for future growth. These plans will be submitted, their updates at the end of 2021. We've been holding workshops for Mission Creek. The last one was held on May 11th, and we have a link will be provided if you're interested in seeing past materials or to sign up for future notices. And in the Indio subbasin, our next workshop is scheduled for June 24th. So this is just a quick summary of our groundwater conditions and where we're at going into this drought period. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for that presentation on our conditions here in the Coachella Valley. Your presentation does remind us that drought here looks a little bit different than other parts of California, which we're in pretty good shape so far. So just want to reiterate that any questions that you may have, we're going to try and address those, as many of those at the end of the presentations. You can put them in the chat, the Q&A box, and we'll get to them, as many of them as we can. So with that, we're moving on to our next speaker. I'd like to introduce Ashley Metzger. I've had the pleasure of working with Ashley for the last 5 years at Desert Water Agency. She's our Outreach and Conservation Manager. Along with water management, she is the communications for DWA. She's worked on the agency's past 2 urban water management plans and is involved in various other planning efforts. So welcome, Ashley, and thank you. Take it away.
Thank you, Vicki, and thanks to everyone on the line joining us today and our previous speakers. I'm excited to talk to you guys a bit about another planning effort separate from SGMA, or the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that Zoe mentioned. We are also in the planning cycle right now for our urban water management plans and water shortage contingency plans. So urban water management plans, they're required every 5 years. The last round of them were completed in 2016 for the planning year 2015. We updated ours in 2020, our 2015 plan, just for some population adjustments. DWR is pretty fickle about how they allow us to count for seasonal population, and given that we have a very large snowbird and tourist influx, that's kind of an important factor for us. These plans serve to forecast both supplies and demands for municipal water service, so tap water service essentially, for the next 20 years. They also allow us to assess reliability during drought. So we'll look at a dry year and what would happen in our area if that was followed by 5 subsequent dry years. So it really allows us to make sure we're resilient and capable of responding to and providing water throughout a drought. So next slide, please. There are some new requirements in 2020, things that were optional or we didn't have to do before that 5-year drought cycle I mentioned. Seismic risk assessment, which is really critical here in the Coachella Valley as we are straddling the San Andreas Fault here. Water shortage contingency plan requirements have changed. We'll get into that a little bit later. And then coordinating with the SGMA plan that Zoe mentioned, and of course, factoring in climate change. So for 2020, and all years past, each agency that you see identified here has submitted a separate urban water management plan. And this time around, we have elected to collaborate and work together. And some of the reasons for that include cost savings, collaborative approach to water use efficiency, data consistency, and alignment with our other planning efforts. I frankly think it's great because it allows us to get our responses on the same page. You know, during the 2015 period where we were putting out mandatory restrictions due to the state, you know, some agencies, for example, DWA permitted watering on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and right next door at CVWD, there were different days of the week. So it became very confusing to people. Next slide, please. So we currently have a water shortage contingency plan and an ordinance to go along with it based on our 2020 urban water management plan. It has 5 stages, and each of those stages corresponds to a specific shortage level, and I'll show you that. Actually, let's advance to that now. So the existing stages you'll see on the left, and DWR, the Department of Water Resources with whom Janine works, created some standardized levels that you'll see on the right that they're asking all water agencies to kind of align with. So that's one change that we're making, and it really allows us to spread some of the enforcement actions throughout the different levels so that things aren't ramping up as quickly. We can phase things in over time a bit better, and it's more aligned with the circumstances that we see on the ground. So next slide. Some of the things we have here, and these are just key items. Stage 1 is kind of where all of the water agencies are operating and living now. You know, the existing permanent restrictions that were put in place during the 2012-2016 drought, offering rebates and water audits, discouraging things like overseeding, you know, excessive pool draining, HOAs requiring green grass during dry periods. Stage 2 is when we have a 10 to 20% shortage, we're going to start increasing water waste patrols. Restaurants can only serve water by request. Water will be prohibited during daylight hours. This is an important one. We used to have specific times of day, for example, you know, watering only before 7 a.m. after 7 p.m. Now 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. mean very different things in January and July. So we, as a region, got together and said, let's use daylight hours. Next slide, please. Stage 3 is when we get into restricting watering during certain days of the week. So water is permitted Monday, Wednesday, Friday for spray irrigation, and we are making a carve out here for drip irrigation being allowed any day. Desert Water Agency is looking at prohibiting fountains and misters in stage 3. And we're also looking at no spray watering of medians or parkways during this stage, which corresponds with a 20 to 30% shortage. So stage 4, things start to get serious, more serious than we've seen in the past. There's the moratorium on new landscape, no construction meter use, and only drip irrigation allowed. So basically no sprinklers at all. And then when you look at stages 5 and 6, this is extreme circumstances here. This is something that I would anticipate in response to some sort of natural disaster or malevolent act. So, you know, maybe there's a huge earthquake and we see that we're not going to be able to get imported water for a long time because the earthquake was in Northern California, or maybe there's an earthquake here in our valley. So these situations correspond with more emergent situations. Drip irrigation gets restricted, recycled water only for grass, water for construction purposes prohibited. And then ultimately in a stage 6, we'd be looking at mandatory rationing. So this is, somewhat of an extreme situation. Hopefully we never get there. Next slide. I'm going to skip this one because we're running low on time and I want to get to some questions next. So please go ahead and visit our website, dwa.org/UWMP, and I'll go ahead and put that in the chat for everybody. But we love any feedback we can get on this. We know that these restrictions that are put in place during a drought, especially with drought potentially on the horizon, could have an impact on you at home, your business, etc. So we look forward to hearing what folks have to say, and the board hearings and public adoption start June 15th, and we will be submitting this plan to DWR on July 1st or sooner. So thank you for that, and Vicky's going to come back on and get into the questions.
Thank you, Ashley, for that quick presentation. We do want to take a few questions that have been put in the chat and the Q&A. I think we'll start. We do have some questions in the Q&A. To kind of put it, I guess kind of generalize it, it's about building. Is there going to be, are there concerns of building here in the valley based on the current conditions that we are experiencing, as for long-term planning, rapid growth in housing sales? So I think probably Ashley, you might want to answer that question or
Sure.
Take the lead on that question.
So water agencies are in a bit of an interesting position because we're not land use authorities. It's not really up to us to say how the communities develop and how quickly they develop, and which areas and which sectors develop. Those are really city and council, city council and county roles. So certainly we work in concert with them, but ultimately at the end of the day, our job is to bring in a reliable source so that the water supply is sustainable and so that the future growth and development, to the extent possible and practical, can be supported. So it is important to ask existing homes to conserve, because these new homes that are being built and developed are so much more efficient than older stock homes. I've personally run some analyses on this, and when we look at our older homes, not only is the footprint larger because the lot sizes are bigger, but there's more grass, they're more water intensive, all of the fixtures and appliances use much more water. So I think appreciating the fact that new development is ultra conservative and that there are state codes and local codes to ensure that that's the case is really important.
Okay. We do have a question here also. Maybe shoot this to Janine. If you could answer this. Are there sufficient system interconnections to facilitate relieving overpumping in smaller subbasins by exchanging supplies between agencies? Maybe Janine or Zoe actually might be able to answer that question.
So I'll start out from the statewide perspective, and I think that question was probably really more directed at the local, but at the statewide perspective, if we look at Southern California, for example, that area has been leading the pack for a long time in terms of system interconnections, particularly in comparison to many of the Northern California communities. Today, most of the state's largest water systems do have a good system of interconnections, in part because of seismic risk, realistically speaking. But I think Zoe gets the second part of this question.
Zoe, at the local level?
Yeah, so at the local level, there are interconnections, and there is at least one agency that does move water between the two subbasins. And so that is something that already exists. A lot of, kind of on the macro scale, a lot of it is driven by economies of scales. You don't want, obviously pipes cost a lot of money, so you don't want to create a lot of redundancy at a cost to customers. But there are ways to intertie systems, and when an agency kind of spans both, then they likely do have connections where they can move water between areas.
Zoe, while we have you, there was another question about concerns of possibility of changes in the contract with Colorado River. Is that less water could be supplied for storage? How is that planned for by CVWD, or I guess by DWA for that matter?
So CVWD is the only agency in the Coachella Valley that has direct allocations to the Colorado River. For Desert Water Agency and CVWD, we're also state water project contractors, but since we don't have the infrastructure to bring that state water project water in, we exchange it for Colorado River water with Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. So it is very much a CVWD question when it comes to allocations. And yes, the folks on the Colorado are beginning to look at the next set of guidelines. We're just very early on in that process. What we always like to remind folks is that Coachella Valley Water District's priorities are fairly high. California's in general, but also Coachella Valley Water District. So there are other places that would need to cut their use before we do. Now, that doesn't mean that the ongoing drought in the Colorado River wouldn't affect our supply availability. For example, we participate in the drought contingency plan, where if the different reservoirs reach different levels, we would contribute some amount that would stay there. But this is all well within our allocation, and something that we would be able to do without it impacting at all our ability to deliver Colorado River water for current agricultural uses and for non-potable irrigation to golf courses, HOAs, and also for replenishment.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for that answer. So we will try and address some of these other questions. We would like to go into kind of our wrap-up poll, just to kind of get an idea of what our attendees took away from our webinar, and then we could stay on possibly and answer a few more questions. So going to our poll questions. So if you just take about a minute and just look them over, answer them to the best of your ability, and we'll go over them here, give you about 30 seconds or so. Okay, so let's see what our results are here. So question number 1, did you learn something new today? Yes, a lot. Great. About 56% of you said that you learned a lot today. That's wonderful. We're glad that we can impart these professionals' knowledge to you. That's what these webinars and workshops are about, is to try and keep you well informed. The second question, what is the most important to you about water conservation? And the number one answer was conserving for future generations. I think that probably is one of the most important things that we have to remember, is that what we are doing here is going to affect not only us now, but later on down the line. And the third question, how did you hear about this webinar? Overwhelmingly, it was DWA email. We do try and put a lot of this information through social media on our website, but word of mouth is always in there too. And we're happy to hear that people are discussing and having conversations about these important topics that we do cover. So we're happy that you learned something new, and to know that what's important to you is the same thing that's important to us. So with that, I would like to thank our presenters and our speakers, Janine, Zoe, and Ashley, for speaking and presenting for us. You can see there on the slide that just popped up, that is our contact information. That is my number, and also we do have that URL there about Drought. We do have a Drought page on our website now that's gone up. It's a lot of really good information. I would encourage you to visit it. And you can also reach out to Ashley or myself if you have any questions that possibly haven't been answered, but maybe Zoe or Janine would like to stay on for a couple more minutes and maybe answer a couple more questions if necessary, if you'd like to, if you can. But we appreciate, if you cannot stay on, we appreciate you attending. Thank you so much. We will have also on our website the upcoming June webinar information up soon. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for that one as well. So with that, if you have to leave, we thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a good rest of your day. So we do have a couple more questions here. I guess about, what was it? About rate increases. Ashley, did you, I think you might have answered a couple of those, but we did have a couple more questions about that.
Sure. So it's a little bit tricky timing. You know, different agencies have different procedures and protocols and timing on that. Desert Water Agency had a rate increase slated for July of 2020 that did not go into effect. We are presently starting the process of looking into whether or not we'll need to increase rates in 2022. So if you're in Desert Water Agency's service area, which is Palm Springs area, portions of Cathedral City, then that's not something that's on the agenda for us right now. Zoe can speak a little bit more to CVWD if she'd like, but they did send out a Proposition 218 notice on water rates, which means that they will be considering increasing the water rates, and they have information available on their website for that I can put in the chat.
Yeah, Ashley, that's correct. We just finished a 5-year cost of service and are looking at proposed rate increases. And the proposed rate increases would still put us at some of the lowest rates in the region, not just Coachella Valley, but I think in general, the Coachella Valley, when compared to surrounding areas in the arid Southern California, we all do really well at maintaining rates very competitively low.
Yeah, we're very fortunate to overlie a groundwater basin here. I mean, not only does it provide an excellent buffer for years that we face drought conditions, but because of the quality of the water that we receive or extract from the groundwater basin, we don't have to, by and large, have large treatment plants for most of the water that we provide. And that makes a big difference in costs as well. I also saw some questions from someone about golf courses facing restrictions. And I do think if we got into extreme situations, yes, a golf course certainly would face cutback. It may be if your golf course is on recycled water, you have more flexibility because those restrictions come a little bit later in the draft water shortage contingency plans. But if you're on pumped water, that, you know, that's a challenge too, and it depends how the state restrictions roll out to some extent. So yes, I would definitely consider it to be a possibility. So
yeah, I think that was a question, you know, also too, if that's going to be something that's going to kind of trickle down from the state, that we might be asked to conserve more because of the current situation. So, you know, with that being said, would there be more restrictions on, say, golf courses or residential homes or commercial businesses? So
sure. So the last drought, there was really a one-size-fits-all approach, and I had intended to get into this in my presentation, but there was such good content, and I really wanted to leave time for Q&A. There are so many situations that could unfold, but during the last drought, it was really a one-size-fits-all approach to some extent from the state. They said, you know, the State Water Board looked at how much you used, and if you used a lot of water, you had to cut back a lot. Now here in the desert, it's very dry and hot, so we have to use a lot of water, and so we had to cut back a lot. It had nothing to do with our water supplies. Now, at the end of the 2012-2016 drought, they allowed us to do a self-certification on supply and demand to demonstrate whether or not we needed conservation measures. And when we did that assessment, all of the local water agencies had a 0% conservation requirement, meaning we did not have to continue the 36 or 32% levels handed down by the state. This time around, you know, the governor in his drought declaration and Q&A following with the media repeatedly said, you know, a one-size-fits-all approach is not what we're doing here. It doesn't make sense right now. And, you know, he noted that we're looking at these mandatory restrictions from the state possibly after another dry year. So that we're in year 2 of, you know, dry conditions. If we get to year 3, possibly we'll have to look at some statewide actions, but by and large, the idea of enhanced water shortage contingency plans is that they're appropriate region by region and agency by agency to assess their local conditions as to whether or not actions are necessary.
I think we've pretty much answered everybody's questions. We do have a few more. We'll go ahead and put our emails in the chat, just in case we didn't cover yours, and you would like to send us maybe a couple questions. We can, if it's something Ashley or I can't answer, we can refer to Zoe or Janine and get those questions answered for you. But I think we're going to wrap up here and just say thank you for attending. Again, thank you for staying on for some of the additional questions, and we will add our emails into the chat so you can send us your questions if they weren't answered here on the webinar. But thank you very much for attending. Thank you to all of our speakers and presenters, and have a great day, the rest of your week, and stay safe. Thank you.